Yes, yes. Corals, I feel, are, sorry, my slides are not advancing, so I'm just trying to think on the fly here. Corals are one of my favorite animals, even though they look like rocks. My slide is not advancing, sorry. Even though they look like rocks, right? I was a very hyper child, growing up in the middle of the Midwest. Thank you so much. Thank you. Now it's working. Thank you. So growing up, I was very hyper. Back in the 1970s, you remember red dye #5, right? So I was bouncing all over. But to get me to calm down, my parents would turn on PBS on Sunday nights, and I would tune in to the undersea adventures of Jacques Cousteau. You remember, right? The red-capped sailor, yeah. And it seemed like to me, when I was 4, 5, 6 years old, that magic did exist in the world. But I was at that age, right, where I was trying to figure out, well, what's real magic, and like what's fairy tale magic, and what's real magic. And it seemed to me that the real magic on this planet was under the waves. And I couldn't wait to grow up and see it for myself. I was 21 when I finally got certified to become a scuba diver. In my last quarter of college, I was able to take a course from NAUI, which is based in Navy. And when I was 25, 2 years later, in 1999, I got to see coral reefs for the very first time in the Caribbean. And I was just blown away by the diversity, the electric flash of light, the beauty, of course, but also just this knowledge that this incredible resource here exists on our planet. And we're so lucky that we get to see it. How many divers, by the way, do we have? Okay, so we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 divers. Any snorkelers? All right, we've got 3 snorkelers. We got some more snorkelers. All right, great. Ocean enthusiasts. Fantastic. So we all fall under this ocean enthusiast. So in terms of their beauty and their diversity, corals really cannot be rivaled. They have, in terms of their species, about 800 species can be found worldwide. Most of those are in the Indo-Pacific. I'm more familiar with the coral reef species, of which about 10% reside there. But overall, these coral reefs that cover our Earth, they are home to so many species, and we're going to talk about the percentage, but over 400 fish species have been discovered. But the real crazy thing is that scientists are telling us we've only scratched the surface. We've barely just begun. And it could be close to 1 million organisms on a coral reef. And of the ocean floor. So when I started talking about coral reefs, by the way, the scientists said they only covered 0.1% of the ocean floor. So in the last decade, they've discovered through new technologies, some of which divers can assist with, and we'll talk about at the end of this presentation, but they've discovered that actually there are more coral reefs than even suspected. But even so, that small little percentage supports up to 25% of the life in the ocean. When you think about the big fish like grouper and snapper and even barracuda, right? Those types of large sport fish, they really need to come up in a safe environment. And so coral reefs are not only the cities under the sea, they're nurseries as well for those species. And just like rainforests, they have an incredible amount of biodiversity. Now, I'm a coral nerd. I can tell you that I actually call rainforests the point is respect for our mother. I always say she's like, the reefs are like Mother Teresa. You know, so because they're only so many of them in the ocean, and so the ones that we do have, we really have to bolster and give as much support as we can in our resilience. The crazy thing about these things is that they're the only living animal that we can see from space, right? Because all these corals create a giant colony that can be seen from space, the barrier reefs. But even these big, mighty colonies are very fragile. They live at the very narrow range of temperature tolerance. So temperature gets a little high, they're not happy. Gets low, they're not happy. What we're worrying about now is not the temperature is getting too low, of course. We're actually worried about the temperatures getting too high. And they were already under a good deal of local pressures, I would say, when you think about pollution from all the coastal development that happens. There's also a lot of eutrophication that happens in the ocean where the fertilizers that we use run off into the ocean, and that causes these incredible algae blooms. And that takes up a lot of the oxygen. It also creates turbidity, which affects the clarity of the water, and corals need warm, clear water. So just to point this out, that in recent decades, they have been showing greater signs of stress because of these global pressures. These local pressures are exacerbated, of course, by these global pressures. Now, the small but mighty coral is only about the size of your pinky fingernail, right? About a pencil eraser is about how big they are. The average coral grows about ½ an inch to an inch a year, but there are some species that can lay down their calcium carbonate exoskeleton a lot quicker, though. And we love those animals because they're very helpful to coastal communities. But it's really interesting to see these guys feeding at night. How many of you have gone on a night snorkel or a night dive and you've seen the polyps come out of the exoskeleton? So this is the tiny little mighty coral polyp, and it's got feeding tentacles that come out of its exoskeleton at night. During the day, it's hidden, and so we don't get to see those tentacles. But what's interesting about all of this is all the color comes from an algae that lives inside the coral animal. It's an algae called zooxanthellae. You can call it zoox. Scientists also call it zoox for short. And these zooxanthellae are so important for coral. It's a symbiotic relationship. Without this coupling, obligate coupling, as scientists call it, the coral reefs cannot survive. So the corals have these algae inside, which give them 95% of their carbohydrates, gives the corals all the oxygen they need. Feeding at night, and them get really 5% of their nutrients. So 95% comes from that zooxanthellae. Very, very important. And it's important not just to the ocean species. We talked about the 25% of the ocean's inhabitants, right? But the people that live there are 200 million people around the world that are relying on those coastal Caribbean or coastal coral reefs like a speed bump. You know, it's keeping those waves from crashing into those coastal communities. And so 200 million people, and we're looking at poor, more developing nations, really rely on those structures. And they're also providing a lot of protein for the Earth's inhabitants. About 3 billion people on this planet rely on seafood for protein. And we just learned that the reefs are the nurseries for the oceans, and very important. Tourism, of course, is also an important thing that the reefs provide. $36 billion alone just for coral reefs. But all told, when you think about sailing, when you think about sport fishing, when you think about laying on the beach, this is parrotfish poop, guys. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But when you talk about laying on the beach, this feeds into that $2.7 trillion. So we've got to have these intact systems to have that industry running as normal. Even more important, a lot of medicines are being found on reefs, just like in the rainforest. And it may be that we're hemorrhaging the world's most valuable medicine cabinet just as we're discovering it. And this kind of goes back to that 10% species discovered. Who's to say what exists among those 90% species that we haven't discovered? ARA-C, ARA/C, that's a very important chemotherapy drug that's used in leukemia. That comes from the reefs, namely the barrel sponges in the Caribbean. Those are also very long-lived animals, like corals, can live thousands of years if left alone. But I'm seeing more and more sponges are also struggling as well. So it's all, when I say coral reefs, it's the whole system, right? It's not just the corals, it's the entire system that they support. Very important. And so we talked about the local pressures that they're under, pollution, right? Coastal development, runoff from all of that, and that robs the oxygen and depletes the oxygen. But the major issue that corals are dealing with is a warming planet. And that warming planet really does a number on the ocean. We're very familiar with what happens on land, right? But the ocean kind of has a really bad PR problem. Always has with our species. It's out of sight, it's out of mind. For many of us, we've gone below, we've experienced that world, but for the vast majority of humanity, one of the things I studied in my graduate studies when I wanted to learn how to help coral reefs is I learned how the minds of Americans work when it comes to ocean issues. And when it comes to the ocean, people think of the ocean as the surface. If you actually Google the ocean, the top 25 images, I guarantee you, are all surface, or they're charismatic megafauna. And so that's our connection. But what I'd like to talk about is what's happening here on the microscopic scale. So our planet, right? If this orange is our planet, our atmosphere affects what goes on in the ocean so much. And that atmosphere is so thin. If you gave this orange a coat of varnish relative to the thickness of this orange, that's how thin the atmosphere is. Very, very thin. But it's trapping a lot of heat as the decades continue. And it might be surprising for you to learn that 90% of the heat that is accruing on this planet is actually getting absorbed by the ocean. Yay, ocean. But again, that out of sight, out of mind problem really rears its head when we start talking about global climate change. The first thing I want to talk to you about is coral bleaching. Have any of you been swimming along in the reefs and you've seen the bright white coral skeletons? Kind of similar to what you would see here if it washes up on shore dead. It's gonna look white because the zooxanthellae that's inside is not living inside that coral for right now, right? Because we know that the algae that lives in the coral and gives us its color and provides all of these wonderful things, it takes off. The coral expels it because when heat rises in the ocean, that algae creates a toxin that is going to kill the coral. So the coral is like James Bond in the casino. He's Casino Royale, gambling everything, right? Getting rid of all the zooxanthellae in the hopes of recruiting more heat-tolerant zooxanthellae. There are different clades of Symbiodinium, or zoox, as I call them, the scientists call them, that exist in the water column. And so the coral is hoping to recruit those heat-tolerant zooxanthellae. Doesn't always get around to it, doesn't always get lucky, but sometimes if the heat comes down after about 3 weeks and doesn't go on for months past that month mark, then that they might recruit zooxanthellae back into their skeleton, get their life back, and continue. Or if the temperature doesn't go back to normal levels, they may die and they may get covered with macroalgae. So this is just a graph that talks about sea surface temperature. And you'll notice that the temperature here in black, of course, is going up through the decades. And you'll notice here the coral cover, as indicated in the blue, as it's going through the decades, it's relatively stable until our first major global mass bleaching that happened in 1998, the year before I saw my first Caribbean reef. And what happened after that first mass bleaching was the cool thing that happened was the temperatures started to go back to almost a more, I would say, regular sort of cycle for coral to deal with, and they were able to rebound, which is good, right? So in that 10 years, they were able to rebound. But then the next massive bleaching came. Coral cover was not able to rebound, and we're starting to see it go down and down through the decades. So all this to say, if we can help coral along, if we, this one species on this planet, can help coral do anything in our own little corner of the world to help it become more resilient, then we can give it a chance to adapt. So I was talking to some of you earlier about some of the coral reef restoration projects that are going on around the world. Very exciting. I know one of the places I was interested in learning about coral reef restoration was in the Virgin Islands, St. John to be exact. Any one of you been to St. John? Yeah, it's lovely, lovely island. You fly into St. Thomas, take a little boat out to St. John. Couldn't wait to go there because, of course, I had heard that there was a coral reef national monument that Bill Clinton had put in his 11th hour of his administration, right before he was out. He made it a national monument, and that meant that everything you see within this green area here is protected, right? So that was a real coup, not only for the entire island here, which is a birder's paradise, but also the fringing reefs. So here we have a national monument. Couldn't wait to dive these reefs. Unfortunately, we went in 2006. And in 2005, 2006, the Virgin Islands, namely St. John, St. Thomas, St. Croix, experienced 50 to 60% die-off of the corals. That means they bleached, right? And the temperatures didn't go back down to a normal level. So they were dead. The macroalgae came and took over. Very bad. Some of the corals were able to survive, and they did what you see here. They bleached, but they started coming back, namely, especially around the cooler areas. So this is just an example of what it looks like as it's starting to come back to life. But it was a pretty bad die-off, right? 50 to 60%. I mean, we had a lot of fun, my husband and I, that week. But I remember every night I would go back to the place we were staying at and just try to process, right, what all this loss means. I tend to focus on a dive, as I was telling some of these folks, I tend to focus on the life that's there and what's working nowadays. But back then, I saw a lot of what was falling apart on these systems, and it really disturbed me. We actually got to talk to scientist Jeffrey Miller, who works with the U.S. Geological Survey, and he works with the coral reefs there. And he too felt like this was something that was happening out of sight, out of mind. And if there only was a way to communicate this to people, right? This was back in 2006. So he developed this slide: national monuments, famous ones. Mount Rushmore, Grand Tetons, right? Statue of Liberty. How many of you have visited any one of these places? All of them. Very good, very good. So what would you feel like if you showed up and that's what you saw? That's kind of what I felt like. And it's what I feel like every time I visit a reef. If I focus on full image, there's very few of us that have a passport to this paradise underwater, and we're witnessing this. So our words, our experiences, all those hours that we log and we cherish, I will tell you that the 350 hours I have logged underwater are probably, I hate to tell you, babe, the 350 best hours of my life. Yeah, they're amazing. And so this stuff means a lot. So if you can tell your network, if you can just talk to people about this, you're doing your part in your little corner. That's coral bleaching. Let's talk about the chemistry changes that are going on in the ocean. Ocean acidification, that was that second of that three-pronged attack. What's happening is, well, what goes up must come down. Yes. So as we are almost thickening that coat of varnish because we're burning fossil fuels like coal, oil, natural gas, the byproduct is CO2. That CO2 creates like a heat trapping blanket around our planet, trapping more and more heat. But it's also readily absorbed by the ocean. You might remember Henry's law about gases getting absorbed. The ocean is readily absorbing these CO2 and it's turning it into carbonic acid. And that's a big problem for an animal like coral, which gets its calcium and its carbonate ions out of seawater. That's what this animal does, y'all. It creates like cement out of seawater. Isn't that incredible? So when the chemistry changes and their calcium and carbonate ions aren't as readily available, not only do they have a hard time creating their structure, but they actually start to disintegrate. And what you see here is an example of calcium carbonate animals that actually have started to disintegrate. These are shells, calcium carbonate, starting to disintegrate in a more acidic environment. This here is plain water. This is vinegar. Now, the oceans are never going to be as acidic as vinegar. Not even close. But what is happening on a macro scale in the ocean is happening, what you see here. The shells of pteropods, zooplankton, are beginning to dissolve. And so when we talk about the ocean becoming more acidic, it's not just bad for corals, it's bad for zooplankton, which provide 50% of the Earth's oxygen. So like Ron Burgundy, they're kind of a big deal, right? We definitely want the zooplankton on Earth, not to mention all the delicious stuff that we like to eat. Ken Caldeira, I love this man. He is one of the scientists who created one of the first models to figure out how ocean acidification would affect life on this Earth. And he did it on a macro scale with an actual simulation of an ocean in Lawrence Livermore University. But nowadays, they can use computer modeling, which means our computer modeling for climate change and how it affects the ocean is going to become more and more accurate. But he famously said that corals trying to build their shells in an ocean acidic world is almost like building a house of Legos, while someone is stealing your Lego bricks actively. And so the bricks that are getting put together are kind of haphazard. And when you look at the coral structures that are putting themselves together in acidic seas, you see that they're not as strong too. So when a climate-related disaster like a hurricane comes along and batters those corals, they're not going to be as strong to withstand the storms. So Ken Caldeira, he's very important in terms of ocean acidification. He's been telling people for the last couple decades what's happening, but I feel like now people are finally starting to listen. The great thing about corals is they are in warm water. And if you remember, Henry's law talks about partial pressure of gases. Those gases are going to be more readily absorbed at the poles. So it's going to take a little bit longer for the carbonic acid to make its way to the reefs. So if we can help coral reefs survive the onslaught of heat, then it's going to be a lot longer before ocean acidification becomes an immediate problem for them. But once it does, it's baked into the cake for about 100,000 years. That CO2 is not going to come out of the ocean very quickly. It's going to be in the carbon cycle for a while. So we definitely want to avoid ocean acidification at all costs. Heat, that can be changed relatively quickly. Ocean chemistry, that's not something that we will come back from in our lifetime, for sure. Now, this is when I started diving. You can see the optimal coral habitat in terms of chemistry. The blue dots are the coral reefs. Optimal, you've got a lot of green here. This is when I wish I would have started diving, but Jacques Cousteau was not around in 1880. He did not invent the aqualung. This is when I started diving the reefs in the Caribbean and around the world. You see a reduced area of optimal area for coral reefs, but when I'm finally retired, this is what I've got to work with. So this is why I've come back to the dive industry. I've been away for 25 years. And then I am back because I want to talk about what's going on here. I want to make meaning of this. And because there is something that we can do, even from the Midwest, our seafood choices. If we make sustainable seafood choices, that can help the animals that reside on 70% of this planet. You've probably heard a little bit about stony coral tissue loss disease. This has gotten a lot of attention in the last decade. I have to say, when I started talking about coral reefs, this was not an issue, but it's become one of the biggest issues. And although it is a what you would call a local stressor, it's becoming worse with global climate change. This is one of the areas where the divers can actually make a difference. So when you come home from a dive trip or a snorkeling trip or hanging out on the beach and you're swimming around corals, make sure you wash any gear really, really well before you go to another destination, let's say, because there is a lot of scientific evidence to support the fact that this tissue loss disease is actually being transported, and it's appearing in a lot of dive hotspots. So they're looking at ballast water in boats, and they're looking at dive gear. So it's always good to rinse your dive gear out, right? rinse it out nice and good. So you want to make sure that you're not accidentally transporting this disease. Poor water quality, as I said, sedimentation, that's also becoming more prevalent. I was just in Cozumel last month celebrating my 50th birthday, and I noticed that the water was a lot murkier, a lot more turbid, and a lot of that has to do with all of the macroalgae that's in the ocean. And we saw a lot of macroalgae washing up on the shores, which is not only hard for corals to grow in water that's turbid, but also think about all the sea turtles that are coming up on the beach, right? These little hatchlings that get caught up in this big macroalgae. It's not good for them. Meanwhile, scientists are trying to get a handle on this while the baselines are shifting. Imagine if you're trying to understand how a rainforest works as it's being bulldozed around you. That's kind of what's happening with scientists and coral reefs. And so back in the early 2000s, when I was in grad school, I was talking a lot to anyone who would listen about the need to get apples to apples comparison of what's going on. Not just this reef looks healthy and that reef doesn't look healthy, but what does this reef look like 10 years later, 20 years later, 30 years later, that same exact reef. And if you watch Chasing Coral, a movie that we're actually going to be screening in our pool area next week, if you watched it, that's exactly what scientists are doing right now. They're addressing the shifting baselines, not only for their own self, but for the public's awareness. Because divers, snorkelers, ocean enthusiasts that look, we may see, notice that a bommy that looked like this in 1959 now looks like this in 1998. Here's the diver for scale. This occurred in just 3 months on Lizard Island on Australia's Great Barrier Reef. Massive bleaching event. And then what happens is the coral animals are not coming out at night, right? They're not making sure that their skeleton is kept clean because they have no energy. So they stay in their skeleton and macroalgae grows on. The grazers, which can actually save them, and we're going to talk about the grazers are starting to be overfished. So without those grazers, then the macroalgae has a real head start. And it's a turf war, basically. If you've watched West Side Story, I don't know who the Jets are and the Sharks are, but it's like they're all in the ocean, man, like trying to get their space, right? And coral included. Coral's a big turf war in itself. But what we don't want is macroalgae to take over. Don't want that to happen because we can't have a healthy ocean with just macroalgae. Let's face it, I did not point out that these are the construction crews of the metropolises in the ocean, right? So these are creating the 3D structures that all the animals live under. Very, very important. We talk about climate-related disasters. 2020 was the first time we had 5 named storms all at once. I think there was a total of 30 named storms that hit or that existed, and I think it was 11 that made landfall. So we're starting to see frequency is increasing and the severity of the hurricanes are increasing. Yes, we're going to have hurricanes without global climate change, for sure. And in fact, hurricanes without global climate change are actually pretty good for corals because what happens is turns up the water. When you're talking in category 1, it's turning up the water, right? It's pulling that deep, cold, nutrient water from below. It's giving the reefs a little bit of health. It's almost like sweeping them, right? But when you're getting category 3, category 4 is making landfall, it's decimating those speed bumps, right? So this is something that scientists are very concerned about in the coming years. Speaking of concern, there's an entire island. Anyone been to the Maldives? The entire island, I have to say, the cabinet, they pulled an incredible PR stunt, and I give them kudos. They all got certified to scuba dive, and they had a cabinet meeting underwater in which they added a new line item. Find a new island. Yes, they had to move. They are looking at moving their nation to a new island. Whether or not that can actually happen, think of our planet species. We're looking at actually moving to a different planet, which is more feasible, probably a different island. But the reason being is their highest point is 8 feet above sea level. So we're looking at a 15-inch sea level rise in this century. This is really going to affect this island nation. They need another home for their folks. Parrotfish. Second favorite animal. Coral, my first favorite animal. Parrotfish, my second favorite animal. How many of you have seen these guys on the reef? crunching, and munching, right? You've heard them too, probably. Not that we hold our breath. We don't hold our breath when we scuba dive, but in between breaths, you might have heard that. So they're grazing the algae off the coral. They are the grazers that we need. Sometimes, because they have this fused beak, you can see a really good look right there, they graze that algae a little too close to the coral head, and sometimes they bite into some of that coral. But they have a really cool second set of teeth, a pharyngeal mill in their throat that grinds up that coral skeleton, passes through their body as sand, the stuff we like to lay on. A medium-sized parrotfish, or a large parrotfish, I should say, in its lifetime can create up to 700 pounds of sand. So you would think this is an enemy of the coral, but no. Even though it gets coral skeleton, what it's doing is creating a substrate for coral larvae to propagate on, because corals reproduce asexually. So they're releasing gametes in the water. And that larva could land on those newly grazed spots. And in fact, that's how coral reef colonies are growing. So we need the parrotfish. But in island nations where people are looking at living on less than $2 a day, parrotfish are ending up on plates, which is, talk in Haiti, and my warm-up was talking to the folks about their favorite animal. And I was hearing animals I'd never heard before, because I just talk, it's my favorite warm-up. I was hearing rabbit, I was hearing goat, I was hearing fish, sheep. It's like, wow, why do you guys like these animals so much? The taste. Yes, different perspective, very different perspective. So we can proselytize and say, don't eat parrotfish, but the fact of the matter is, you've got in Haiti 87,000 artisanal fishermen out there on these boats that are just trying to feed their family. So getting the word out is important, but also understanding where people's perspective is equally important. I think talking about how important they are is a good first step. They have an incredible journey, by the way. They're not a boring animal. They start off pretty much all female. You've seen these guys. These are stoplight parrotfish when they're juvenile. Sometimes this is their last stop. They stay female. They're happy. They've got a super male. They're in a harem. They're swimming around. They're one of 7 intermediate phase females, and life is good. Well, what happens when the male dies? The biggest female becomes a super male. These are sex-changing fish, which is really kind of cool. So this would be the final super male stage. And we want these animals to get past that intermediate and that juvenile stage. When we were in Haiti, what I did see was a lot of juvenile and some intermediate. I did not see a single super male. So that's not good. That's not good. But they're not alone. They also have a sidekick, batfish. It's like a little comic strip. Rabbitfish, I believe rudderfish and surgeonfish also are really important. So what this is called is response diversity. Scientists say this ecosystem needs not just one animal that responds to macroalgae, but a variety of species that can help with that macroalgae, because we want to make sure that the turf war doesn't get won by macroalgae. They're not going to provide a home to 25% of the ocean's inhabitants. The way we can do this is we can support marine protected areas. Australia, which is where I got to go when I was in grad school, I learned a lot about their marine protected areas. And they have taken their no-take areas from 5% to 33%. And the way to do that is through talking to the public. And the politicians are going to listen to their constituents, just like they do in this country. The constituents, the constituents need to be a little louder, I think, when it comes to coral reef. And so that's why I'm here. Hopefully we can talk about the need to protect these coral reefs, because unlike sea jellies, who they're related to, these are stationary animals. They can't float around the ocean, right? Now, sea turtles, it's impossible to talk about coral reefs without talking about the life that it supports. And I know sea turtles are a lot of our favorite animals, third favorite animal, so I got to talk about it. Loggerhead sea turtles. If you've ever seen one of these, they have a head that's like twice the size of a dinner plate. They're really struggling though, because the temperature of the sand affects whether or not they're going to hatch. So if it reaches above 36 degrees Celsius or 93.7 Fahrenheit for an extended period of time, the eggs don't hatch. But here's another thing. If they do hatch and it's still warmer than normal, the sex ratio is getting thrown off. I mentioned loggerheads. In Florida, 90% of the loggerheads are being born female because it's hot chicks, cool dudes. That's how you remember it. Hot. So the nest gets hot, you're going to have more chicks, more females. You're going to have less males. So the sex ratio gets thrown off. We want the beaches to be like they were for millennia for sea turtles, because that is what determines their 50-50 ratio. Also, another thing that's besides the macroalgae on the beach, sea level rise. You've probably heard that these incredible animals like have a mental map of where they were born, right? And they come back to that beach, those females, and they lay eggs throughout their lifespan, which can be over 200 years. The beaches are changing in not only decades, but from year to year. So that's another reason to talk to folks about climate change, even if they're not getting below the waves. A lot of us really love sea turtles. All right, I want to go back to this place, the place that I talked about, the National Monument. This place in particular called Hurricane Hole. Now remember, this became a national monument in 2001. Prior to 2001, the good old folks of the USA, they did whatever they wanted to in Hurricane Hole with their boats. And in fact, that was the spot to put those boats when a hurricane came. That's why they call it Hurricane Hole. It was perfect because they had prop roots from the mangroves that they could tie their boats off of. And you can see how well protected it is. Well, once it became a national monument, the boats were not allowed to tie off onto the mangroves. So it was protected. Don't ask me what they did with the boats during hurricanes. I have no idea. But I do know what happened once the mangroves got protection. Once the mangroves were protected, coral reef species started migrating to the cooler waters of the mangroves. So this is a success story. And we're starting to see a coral reef garden growing in places that they didn't exist. This is happening around the world. There are ranges that will be changed, and that means we'll lose range and gain range, right? But the mangroves are very, very, very important reef ecosystems in and of themselves. So protecting them is a great idea. Here's what you can do. If you're an ocean enthusiast, here's what we can do. Be a buoyancy ninja. This is for the divers especially, because when you're in the water and you're hanging out and you're neutral, you want to go very close to the coral reefs, right? And you want to see what's going on. We tend to, I think, overestimate our ability to like hover. And a lot of times divers will accidentally crash because their buoyancy is not where it needs to be. Patty offers a really incredible class called Peak Performance Buoyancy. My husband and I took it back in the early 90s before we ever went to a reef. And it changed the way we dived forever. We practiced with zebra mussels. We would be in the quarry and we'd be like, I want to see what that zebra mussel is doing. So you'd exhale like a ninja, go down, and you can inhale at just the right moment and keep yourself from crashing into the reef. And it's this whole superhero feeling. So I highly recommend doing it. Being a slow, lazy diver is the diver way. Just float and enjoy what's going on. Don't be kicking around and stuff. The more you kick around, the more you're likely to hit something that you shouldn't. Keeping your distance is a great idea. If you can stay 5 feet above the reef, great. If you need to move in, just make sure that you're in control of your buoyancy. I was talking to one of the participants that's here tonight earlier, a couple weeks ago, about photography and the early photographers that would tell the divers, you know, if you have to just grab onto a ledge to get that shot, you do it. That's how you get the shot. Well, that I do think was what was talked about in the 20th century. I think in the 21st century, though, it's time to talk about what's really important here. Is it the shot, or is it that we have a place to dive? I think it's that we have a place to dive. So if you're going to dive with the camera, definitely take Peak Performance Buoyancy. And there's a lot of sunscreens that say they're reef safe, even sunscreens that say reef safe that aren't reef safe. So make sure that your sunscreen is reef safe, not just when you go to the ocean, but even if you're tubing. on the rivers around here, because stream to sea, everything that's in the streams eventually makes its way to the sea. And of course, sunscreens are really not great for corals. They're photosynthesizing, right? So they're using light. Anything that screens that is going to be a barrier to that. Here's some don'ts. Just don't touch anything. Just don't. Don't take souvenirs. A lot of times with photography, photographers might not be thinking necessarily about how they're perceived by the animal. So imagine what it's like, you know, to be like chilling on your favorite ledge and you're hanging out with your reef homies and this giant camera comes at you. I mean, it could be a little stressful. So don't harass the animals. Don't make their lives more stressful. They're dealing with change as it is. Let's make their lives as less stressful as possible. Littering. Luckily, when we were at Cozumel this last time, we didn't see a lick of litter. And that's because a lot of divers dive against debris. They've been trained, especially trained. It's a wonderful PADI class you can take, a specialty that will train you to remove debris from the reefs. And you can keep a life tally of how many pounds of trash that you're removing, which is really kind of cool. And then don't feed animals too. I talked about feeding coral reefs, coral polyps sometimes at night. You can probably shouldn't do that, but it's really fun to do. But not feeding animals is probably a good idea. If you want to take citizen science into your own hands, there are ways to do this. You can contact Coral Watch. You can get one of their really, really cool boards that you can dive with, and you can do surveys of the coral and the color. And then you can upload those surveys to online, and that data gets put into an interactive map, and then you're helping scientists gather data, which is something I did in grad school, which was super, super fun, but very, very hard to do in the Indo-Pacific because there's a lot of corals to know. What's happening nowadays is there's a lot of coral reef nurseries that are going up. They're raising the coral reefs and the corals in labs, and then they're attaching them on the reefs. One thing I would love to do here at Dive Right and Scuba is I would like to start sustainable dive tourism trips. And I would like to take you to places like Bonaire, and we can get a special certification in a day-and-a-half class for $220. And that will turn us into volunteers, teach us how to do this process. And so for the rest of our lives, when we go there, we could volunteer and be a part of the solution. Which I just love. And I also was talking to a participant that has met individuals across the Caribbean who are doing this on their own as well, even in places like Cozumel. So whatever you can do to make this corner of the globe safer for corals will actually support so much life on this planet. Speaking of our planet, I'd like to leave you with this little picture here. This is, as Carl Sagan called it, the pale blue dot. This is our Earth. This is planet Earth suspended like a mote of dust in a sunbeam. And he famously said that, you know, this is our home. This is it. All of the tragedies, all of the triumphs, all of the wars, all of the dictators, all the kings, all the peasants, all the lovers, all the mothers, the fathers, all the hopeful children, they've all existed on this tiny little speck. And there is no indication that there is help elsewhere for us. This is our home. It's all we've ever had. It's all we're ever going to have. And it's worth doing what we can to protect. These animals don't have a voice, but we do. And every single day we can use it. I hope that it's not the end. I hope that as our oceans change and coral reefs struggle, this one species meets this moment. We can do this. It doesn't have to be the end. It could be the beginning. Thank you. So I really appreciate you being quiet for 45 minutes and letting me talk about my favorite animal. Thank you. But now is your chance to talk. I don't know if we are successful in streaming or not, but okay, cool. We do have some folks that are joining us online. And so Brian here is going to take any of your questions. He may have you say that in the microphone.
So people online can hear you.
Yeah. So we talked a lot. I've skipped around as I'm apt to do. But if there's anything you would like to add or ask, we'd love to hear from you.
I have a question.
Yes, Mark.
So you talked about one of the things that science is doing is they're growing corals and they're transplanting them onto reefs.
Yes.
And listening to you talking about the warming waters and things like that, my question is kind of like a CPR. You know, we in CPR you artificially breathe on somebody, and in the warming waters, are there studies or are there things that scientists are trying to explore to create, you know, like a CPR? Can we help the corals feed? Can we help the corals breathe? You know,
Yeah.
what kind of artificial support can we give them for that 3 months until professional help, nature, can arrive?
3 weeks. That's a great question. So, like, they basically have 3 weeks to survive before they run out of energy because the zooxanthellae is not there and the corals will die. So that's a great question. Back to the reef renewal program that I was talking about in Bonaire, where they're propagating these corals in nurseries and then attaching them. What they are doing in the nursery process is they have a PhD candidate who is working on an experiment where they're subjecting the corals to heat as in their juvenile phase before reattaching them. So they're trying to condition them ex situ before they put them in situ back into the ocean. Another thing they're doing is I've heard just recently that they will take fragments from these nurseries and bring them back to the lab during periods of extended warming. So giving them a safe haven. So that's the cool thing about those places that do fragmentation is, you know, they can take them back. I even heard about a mobile nursery that has like an aquarium on a truck that you can put them. But also, what they're also doing in other places, not reef renewal, but other places around the world, is they're creating super corals. Some scientists don't like the term super reefs or super corals, but essentially these are heat tolerant corals with heat tolerant zooxanthellae, and you can breed the two and create super corals. And there are places in the world that, because of archipelagos like Palau, because the water has sat there and become acidic and warm because of the way that the water is situated, it's almost created a little ocean acidification experiment for those corals. And they, over time, were able to adapt. So those can be harvested, grown in labs, and reattached elsewhere around the world because they're genetically similar. Does that answer your question?
It does.
Yeah, because it doesn't make sense to just create babies and then throw them to the wolves, right? So they are trying to figure out a way to safely, you know, shepherd those corals through their juvenile phase. Yeah. I mean, but what's really incredible, guys, and I haven't even gotten to talk about this yet, because this just came out in March of this year, is that scientists have figured out a way to take our video footage from our dives and our snorkels. We can upload it, and they can use it to create 3-dimensional maps of corals, which they are doing right now. Yes, it is. So their researchers are doing the thing, but they're saying, guess who's going to do the thing soon? We're finally going to call on the cavalry, which, you know, I've been saying for probably at least a decade and a half that I do believe that the pros in the scuba diving industry should be ambassadors to this realm. I feel like this is our moment to explain what's happening informally on the boats, on the reefs. Think about surface intervals that we take. There's a lot of downtime, like not downtime, but you know what I mean, downtime, where we're not diving, and we need to make meaning and make sense of what we're seeing. And so reflecting on our practice, I think, as dive instructors and dive masters should really become part of it. And I know you and I are talking about hopefully making some waves and making some headway in that, which really happy about. Great question. More questions? Yes.
I really like that you had that.
Oh, yes.
You
Sorry.
mentioned the component as far as divers, what we can do. And regarding the sunscreen, I'm a big proponent of rash guards versus
yes.
sunscreen.
Yeah, that are even better for us.
Right, exactly.
Right.
But when I took the class down in Cozumel, the Cozumel Coral Reef Restoration Program, he said that, you know how we all like to do the swim throughs?
Yes.
He says it's really bad for the corals.
Really?
Yeah. I don't know if
Because
you knew anything about that.
well, I mean, no, actually, I hadn't actually been told that at all. I mean, so you're saying beyond the normal like
think the
proximity.
bubbles and
Yeah, I
kicking.
mean,
Yeah.
obviously the kicking, because
Yeah.
I mean, whenever you have a line of scuba divers go through a swim
Yeah.
through, you know somebody's going to kick
Yeah.
the wall or the ceiling.
Or
Um,
quicksand.
Yeah,
Or
you
keep
get a
saying
lack
it,
of
But
turbidity.
it's also the way that the oxygen goes up and then it's trapped in different pockets that really shouldn't have the oxygen
Yeah, I
there.
hadn't thought about that at all, and that is a great point. Yeah, because there's a lot of dive sites that are like champagne,
Right.
Yeah.
Mhm.
because the bubbles are just like you've got divers going through all the time. So it's like, yeah, I hadn't thought about that.
Do you think that diving in general is hard on the ocean?
Well, I mean, that's like a cost benefit thing,
Yeah.
right? So if we can get every diver to be the Lorax, right? Like if we can talk on behalf of these, if we can be ambassadors, we can turn this thing around. As it is now, it does seem to be that we're getting our recreation from this resource without giving back to it. I do think that there should be a loop, a feedback loop of we're getting something from it and we should be giving. I think there's a great conversations that can be had in the future that I would love to have with Mike here because he's all about protecting this resource. And you know, if you have ideas, let's get started. I would love to start a sustainable dive tourism group that's interested in doing trips that give back.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And making meaning of what it is we're seeing so that we can actually be ambassadors when it comes time to ordering. Let's say we're at a seafood restaurant downtown and, you know, we're looking at the menu and cod and red snapper and a variety of things are on the menu. We can make sustainable seafood choices that are better for the ocean and so that this reef system will be better intact. Yeah. Great. Any other questions or comments? Yes.
What does the shed offer any education for? I mean, what do they do for like, specifically the coral and everything?
Sure. So I did work at the Shed Aquarium for a number of years. I was a volunteer there in the Caribbean Reef area for a decade, along with my buddy here, my dive buddy Bob Bowen. I know, yes, I know they're involved in conservation. Right. To what extent in the Caribbean, I'm not quite sure. I know that probably there's certainly opportunities to increase engagement, and that's what they're looking to do. I know within the Chicago community, increasing engagement, they host a variety of dive clubs there. And if you're interested in getting conservation trips, I'm sure they would be interested in talking to you about that. Yeah. Yeah. They have a young CEO that's doing incredible things there. Yeah. I'm a real big fan of them right now. Yeah, it's good energy, good energy. All right. Well, if there are no more questions, I want to thank you very much for coming, and I hope to see you around. Come and visit me at Dive Right In Plainfield. I'm a new member of the team here. And also, yes, talked about Diver Movie Night. This is next Friday at 7 o'clock here at Dive Right In Orland Park. We're going to be showing in our Flick and Float right here in the pool, Chasing Coral. So you can like chill out. It's free, okay? On a Friday night, you want to chill out in 90-degree pool water, come and see us. And it's a great, great documentary about coral. Highly recommend it. Thanks again. Appreciate you.
Cool.
Whew. Yeah, thank you. So how many of you are thinking of coming next week for the